Now I'd like to discuss the way that V-Ray's rollouts work. Go to the Render Scene dialog and go to the Renderer tab. Here you'll find all the rollouts that control V-Ray. They're all here on this one tab. I'll just work my way down and discuss what some of them do. I'm not going to actually change any settings right now, but I'm just going to give you a top-level overview. This rollout is used to set up your serial number and license server information. And V-Ray works with this copy protection scheme called a license server. It's a separate application that runs down here in the system tray. I have it running right here. About V-Ray just talks about the version number, gives you their logo. The frame buffer. This is a replacement for the rendered frame window. I will enable it. And it says to get the resolution from max, and that's why these are all grayed out. In other words, it's going to get that information over here on the Common tab, right here. So I'll be working with a 320 by 240 test render size. But when I do a rendering, it's going to show up in the special V-Ray frame buffer. And the reason this is nice is it lets you zoom in and pan while you're rendering, so you can check out the results without having to wait for it to complete. Global switches control major features of the program. They're like a top-level control. You can turn off all the lights here, all the shadows here, and so on. Note that you can set an override material just like you can in Mental Ray right here, and this is good for testing. I'll also be using this setting quite a lot. If you check it, it means that you won't be rendering the final image. Instead, you will just be rendering the indirect illumination. So this is really helpful when you're testing out the GI and you want to see how that looks before the image is sampled. The image sampler is perhaps the most important thing in V-Ray. It's right here. And it controls anti-aliasing, and it really makes the image come to life. And there are 3 different algorithms that you can use for that. Now, when I choose the first one, fixed, notice that this rollout changed. If I choose the next one, the rollout changes again. So basically this rollout refers to the choice that's made up here. And just a word about these. This rollout takes the most time. This one is medium. And this one is usually the quickest. But it also is graded by level of detail. Use this one for extremely complex scenes, for medium, and for lower complexity scenes. I'll use adaptive subdivision in this demo. The anti-aliasing filter is the anti-aliaser that comes with Max or Viz, and you should recognize some of these in here. Now I recommend that you don't use this because the sampler is going to do all the anti-aliasing for you. You might want to use this in an animation, but it's really a matter of personal choice. So adaptive subdivision was chosen up here, and this is its rollout. I'll talk more about that a little later, but suffice it to say that the lower the number, the lower the quality. And the minimum is -3. I'll set it at the minimum to do some test renders. Down here we have indirect illumination, and it's off by default. If I enable it, you can see that there are 2 GI engines. One for primary bounces and the other for secondary. So this is important to understand this division. Primary bounces are the global illumination that you actually see from the camera. Secondary bounces are not visible from the camera, but nevertheless they influence the atmosphere in the scene. and they're necessary to create a high level of realism. They're sort of like the basis that the primary bounces are calculated from. So that's why we have these two levels, if you can believe it. There are different GI engines that you can choose in each slot. And they are graded, again, from highest quality, longest time, down to lowest quality, lowest time. So usually what we do is we have irradiance map as the primary bounce, and we have another method such as light cache for the secondary bounce. As I change these things, the rollouts down below likewise changed. This rollout corresponds to this engine, and this rollout is for this engine. If I change this, we get a different rollout. See how that works? So you've already seen how a photon map works in Mental Ray. V-Ray uses this term quite a lot, the quasi-Monte Carlo. You see that here in this rollout. It was also a choice up here in the image sampler, if you remember, adaptive QMC. Now, this term is perhaps one of the most obfuscated terms I've ever heard of. The Monte Carlo algorithm was named because of the casino. It's like a gamble. It's kind of random. Quasi-Monte Carlo was an enhancement on that algorithm, and randomized quasi-Monte Carlo is even more random. I guess creating randomness is not trivial. It's adaptive because there are two different levels you can set. Basically, the idea of QMC is that it manages blurriness. And QMC is a theme running through V-Ray. Because of this, there's a rollout way down here called the RQMC sampler. And the controls down here affect all the places you have QMC in V-Ray. Could be in the GI engine, could be in the sampler, could be in other places too. Caustics are another form of GI, and they apply to specular reflection, and they're off by default. Color mapping is V-Ray's form of exposure control. You don't need to go into the environment dialog for exposure control. It's all right here with these parameters. The camera rollout allows you to create depth of field and motion blur effects. And there's a displacement rollout that covers displacement that occurs in the rendering. The system rollout is on the bottom, and it refers to technical information, such as the frame stamp and log window setting. So there's your quick tour. I recommend saving presets when you make changes to this tab. It makes populating all of the information go much more quickly.